Hello, I'm J.R. Moehringer. I wrote a book called Sutton. Willie Sutton was the most prolific, the most elusive, and to my mind, the most psychologically interesting bank robber in American history. And once upon a time, not all that long ago, in the 20s, 30s, and especially into the 1950s, he was known to every American. He was the face of American crime. He's largely been forgotten today for a bunch of reasons. I think mainly because he was nonviolent. We all remember John Dillinger, Bonnie and Clyde, because they shot up banks and peeled out of town in a cloud of dust. Willie Sutton was artful, he was cunning, he was dashing, and he got caught a lot. And so we don't tend to remember him as much as we do his more violent colleagues.
And yet you discovered Willie Sutton as someone who didn't grow up in the era where he was robbing banks or he was notorious and well known. How did you learn about the history of Willie Sutton?
Well, I didn't grow up in his era, certainly, but my grandparents talked a lot about Willie Sutton. My grandfather was fascinated by the guy. And I grew up, of course, partly in my uncle's bar on Long Island, and the guys in the bar talked a lot about Willie Sutton because he was just like a Robin Hood figure to them. And we don't remember Willie Sutton because he was nonviolent. He was not as maybe sensational as a John Dillinger. But that was the very thing that the people I grew up around admired about Willie Sutton, that he never hurt anybody in the commissions of his crimes. He gave a lot of the money he stole away. He was always taunting police. He was always getting away. As good as he was at robbing banks, he was even better at breaking out of jail. 3 times he broke out of escape-proof prisons. And so that was the thing that the people I grew up with admired about him. And I heard people talk a lot when I was a kid about Willie Sutton. And if you watch a movie late at night, like between 2 and 6 in the morning, a character will often just mention Willie Sutton as kind of the archetype of criminal. And it's amazing how much he pops up in pop culture back in the 40s and the 50s. And then again when he wrote his memoir in 1976. He was somebody known to every American, and now, interestingly, he's really disappeared into the mists of history. Well, I always wanted to write a novel, and this novel gave me the chance to use some reportage, some journalism as a foundation. And so that's what I did. I approached Willie Sutton, the great bank robber from the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and as if it were a newspaper story, as if it were a long magazine piece. I think it was Hilary Mantel who said that, historical fiction fills in the gaps. And that's what readers want. If you stay to the general outlines of the true story and fill in the gaps, the things that aren't known, if you let your imagination fill in those gaps, that's the fiction that historical fiction fans find most rewarding. So that's what I did. I used the real outlines of his story, the real people in his life, as the bones of the story. And then where the record is contradictory or unclear or where nothing is known, that's where I let my imagination run free. And that seemed to, it was most satisfying to me as a reader when I would go back and read the story. So I felt that that was the kind of thing that a reader would tolerate and enjoy, that I'm not making up Willie's life. I'm making educated guesses about the parts of his life that aren't known, the parts of his psyche that aren't known. And I was lucky because there are a lot of gaps, thanks to the fact that he wrote 2 memoirs that contradict each other. The newspaper accounts from those days contradict each other. I requested a lot of FBI files, which are all self-contradicting. The police files are all over the map. So there was nothing but gaps. There was the loose structure of a story. We know basically where he was born, who his accomplices were, when he was in jail. But the rest, you have to imagine. And that's what I did. I only imagined where the record is unclear or contradictory.